Hi, everyone. So it is Monday. Welcome to the second week of History 121, second of 3 full weeks. So pretty soon, before you know it, we'll be halfway through the course. I hope everyone had a good weekend. So today, what I want to talk about, three brief things. First of all, briefly, I want to talk about some announcements for a few modifications that I've made in the course over the weekend. Then I'll spend most of the time talking about the primary sources for today from the Going to the Source book on wartime World War I soldier diaries. And then I'll just briefly say a little bit looking forward to tomorrow and thinking about the sources that we have for tomorrow because they are a little bit different. Just as last Friday's source did not come from Going to the Source, so too tomorrow's source doesn't come from Going to the Source. So I wanted to set that up a little bit for you. So let me start with some general announcements, which you probably saw if you were checking your email or if you saw the notice that came on the announcement post, the announcement forum post. But I was looking at feedback that I was getting on the little feedback tab on Moodle over the course of the weekend. And one of the themes that I heard from people was some dissatisfaction with the worksheets, the Going to the Source worksheets. And I was a little concerned about that too, in the sense that I thought that maybe people were focusing too much on them, maybe spending too much time on them. And the question of is the amount of time that you spend doing it worth anything? And a number of you indicated that you didn't like it very much. And it was really the last assignment that I included when I was designing the class. So I wasn't wedded to that. So I think everyone will probably be happy with this. The worksheets are no longer a required part of the course. You're welcome to do them still. You still have those worksheets are part of the book, and you can use them if you find them helpful. But there's not going to be a mandate to turn them in. Now, the second part of that change, so in taking away the worksheets, what I've done is I've sort of refocused the forums. So whereas last week the forums were asking you to assess two fairly big, broad, all-encompassing thesis statements, and I was hoping you would be able to pull some of the sources from Going to the Source into addressing those thesis questions. Some of you did that pretty well, but some of you continue to sort of look at the O'Donnell lectures or other sources. And what I really wanted the forums to be was to really think hard about how do you interpret and analyze these primary sources and then match them up to a larger thesis statement. And that wasn't really coming across. And I think part of it was a problem in the way that I set that up. So I've changed the way that the forums are set up so that the questions are much more specifically focused on the Going to the Source book. So whereas you're not required anymore to turn in those worksheets, the forums are going to be much more focused on the Going to the Source sources. So for a successful post, you really have to engage with those sources. You should be quoting from them. Your ideas should be based on them. The conclusions that you have should revolve around them. So we'll have the quizzes covering the kind of the big material, the big ideas, the big content, and the forums focused in more on applying that background to thinking about the primary sources. So that's the major change. In addition, there are a few videos or shorter assignments that I reassessed because one of the other comments that I got was some of the additional assignments are maybe weren't adding that much. So I've pared a few things down on a few days. So it's a good idea to go double check the syllabus that's reposted. The syllabus that is there now on Moodle was reposted yesterday and was updated to streamline, clarify. Mostly what I've done is to omit some additional assignments that were there prior. So not much has been added, but a little bit has been subtracted. So I think that will allow you to streamline and sort of focus over the rest of the course. Okay, so with that announcement out of the way, let's think a little bit about the sources that we have for today and for the forum that we'll have for today, looking at 3 diaries from American soldiers who fought in World War I. Let's just kind of hone in on the central question that I'm asking you in the forum for today, which is, how do we take a source like these diaries and make a historical interpretation out of them? In other words, how would you, if you are the historian in this situation, and these are the sources that you have been researching, what can you say more broadly about the history of World War I from these particular sources? So how would we frame that? So there's a couple of things we might think about. So here's one avenue that we might think about it. So a typical way of thinking about the significance of World War I to the United States and to the world is to focus in on this major shift in American foreign policy from what we had talked about last week as isolationism to what will be understood as Wilsonianism, named after Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson is probably the central political figure in American history in turning the United States from an isolationist to an internationalist perspective, or he tries. We could actually say that by the end of the war, he fails. And for the next 2 decades, the United States is, if anything, more adamantly isolationist than it had been before World War I. But Wilson's goal is to turn the United States into an internationalist, outward-looking, internationally leading nation. And he posits his war goals when he actually finally has to take the United States into World War I, more or less against his initial impulses in 1917. He famously says that one of the reasons that the United States has to go to war is to, in his words, make the world safe for democracy, to create an international order that is going to further liberal democracies, free markets, and even at one point in his 14 points, he mentions self-determination, which would seem to imply a fairly anti-colonial perspective, right? If we're coming out of the era of European empires, and Wilson is saying that self-determination is going to be a key for all nations after the end of World War I, it seems like he is talking about a liberal, free market, anti-colonial, American-led order, which is a major shift. So when you're looking at these diaries, do you see any trace of Wilsonian thought in the lives of these soldiers and the experiences of these soldiers? If Wilson is committed to reshaping American foreign policy and having a very sort of clear political idea of what the purpose of the war is there any trace of the political or the geopolitical or the Wilsonian in these soldiers? If so, probably you could make an argument that there is a pretty strong connection between the ideas of the leader at the top, the president, and the ordinary soldiers that are out fighting this war that the president is waging. If there isn't, maybe you can't say or don't want to say something conclusive, but it is kind of suggestive if the experience of the ordinary soldier is completely devoid of politics or political theory or idealism, right? So the first question that we might ask is it possible to write a political history of World War I from these sources? There are a couple of other approaches we might take. So another thing to consider is the legacy of the progressive era. So one of the things that a lot of historians have pointed to about World War I is that it is both the high point and the end point of the progressive movement. It's the high point in the sense that there are a whole lot of progressives. The World War I is very divisive among progressives. There are radicals and pacifists, people like Jane Addams, who are totally opposed to World War I. Eugene Debs goes to war in opposition over World War I. So it's not uniformly embraced as a great thing. But there are a fair number of progressives who are pretty optimistic about World War I, because what is it that they have ultimately wanted? Well, they have wanted a more active government, and they have wanted an active government that is going to intervene to produce better, quote unquote, better citizens. They want immigrants to be assimilated. They want morals to be reformed. They want social science and data applied to all these aspects of life. And one of the things that war does is it greatly mobilizes people, and it greatly enhances the power of the state. So we could say that there are plenty of progressives that were pretty happy when during World War I, the federal government nationalizes the railroads. Because once the railroads are nationalized, you have, for the first time ever in American law, an 8-hour workday for railroad workers. So that seems like, yes, that's the progressivism that we would have thought about 10 or 20 years ago. But on the other hand, we also see wartime progressivism much more coercive than it had been previously, where Jane Addams' version of progressivism is having people come together voluntarily to sort of create this social democracy. Increasingly, the progressivism that we get over the course of the war, you get a snippet of this in that Backstory podcast, is to try to actively create, to coercively change people into progressives' image of ideal citizens. So, for instance, the army becomes seen as an excellent laboratory for producing better American citizens. Keep in mind that a lot of the men who join the military, a lot of them were immigrants. A lot of them came from immigrant backgrounds. A lot of them were working class people. Very few of them had higher educations. In fact, most Americans at this time are not even finishing high school. So the army was seen as one of those social institutions that could produce better citizens, that could teach soldiers how to protect their health. Particularly, this is in the Backstory clip, against venereal disease. It could train them or protect them from the abuse of alcohol. So sort of the first steps toward prohibition are actually taken in army camps, which are run by the YMCA, and prohibit alcohol, prohibit prostitution, have a kind of assimilationist model. So ask yourself this question. Do you see any evidence in these diaries that these soldiers have been affected by these sort of progressive, almost coercive aspects of being molded into a particular type of citizen? Do we see anything that gives us a sense of that? That's a second question that you might consider. So, can we write a history of Wilsonianism from these sources? Can we write a history of progressivism from these sources? Question 2. Okay, maybe we're striking dead ends there. What are some other options? Well, what about a social history? So what do social historians look at? So social historians are concerned with the lives of ordinary people, and particularly looking at demographics, things like class, education, religion, ethnicity, race. Do we learn anything about social class or ethnicity or identity or social status or anything like that from these diaries of soldiers? Are there distinctions in religious identity or social class or anything like that that we can take from this? In other words, do you think you could create a social picture of the world or the society that these soldiers are living in as their soldiers? That's something that might be a little more possible. Finally, we might think it's probably plausible to write the most direct kind of history here as a military history. Do you think you could write a history that sort of charts the progress of American soldiers, or the progress of the American military, or the experience of being in the military from these sources. And if that's the only kind of history that you can write from this, what does that tell us about the limitations of political history or intellectual history or these other kinds of history? So when you look at that forum post and you see the question, what kind of history could you write from these sources? What I want you to be thinking about are here are some of the options of the kinds of history that are being written about this era. What do these sources allow me to say, and what don't they allow me to say? And how do I deal with both of those challenges? So that's the general parameter of what I want you to be thinking about. And, I'll just editorialize a little bit. I think that these sources today are some of the hardest to work with in the whole book, in a way. Diaries in general are kind of tricky to work with sometimes because I think sometimes we might expect to get all sorts of incredible revelations in a diary, but usually what we find are fairly mundane recording of day-to-day activity. And so if we're looking to make kind of generalizations about major historical events, sometimes it can seem frustrating dealing with the quotidian day-to-day stuff of a diary. And you're facing some of that in some of these sources. So acknowledge that, but then try to push through it and say, okay, well, what kind of history could I write from these sources? How representative could I make these sources to come to some other general interpretive statement about World War I or the era of World War I? Okay, so that's what we're looking at today. Let me close with a few words about what we're going to be looking at tomorrow. So, over the course of this week, we're looking at the time period that historians refer to as the interwar period, the period from the First World War to the Second World War. And of course, we're starting at the First World War today, which America enters in 1917, and we're carrying through the Second World War. And actually, by Friday, we're carrying a little bit past that into the mid to late 1940s. So we're basically going from about 1917 to 1948 over the course of this week. So tomorrow, we're moving from the sort of the end of the progressive era into the 1920s. And we're looking specifically at, this is the one day that we have to focus specifically on questions of gender and sexuality. I would really, really have liked to have more days on this subject, but obviously we're limited for time. So tomorrow is the day where we're going to focus specifically on questions of women's experience, questions of gender, and to some extent questions of sexuality. The reason that we're looking at that tomorrow is because the conclusion of World War I saw the end and the success of what is often called the first wave of feminism in American history, which was all geared around the question of gaining women the right to vote. And coming out of World War I, women have the right to vote. The 1920s are also seen as kind of a pivot period because of the rise of what were called the new women, which you probably know of as flappers. In other words, changing norms, changing ideas about youth, about sexuality, about women's independence, about women as sort of self-defining citizens. All of that was sort of in the air in the 1920s. And it was happening at the same time that there was this enormous, really revolutionary shift in the status of women as citizens, women really becoming full independent citizens by the suffrage amendments at the end of World War I. So it's an interesting time to be talking about women, gender, and sexuality. So the sources that you're going to be looking, the O'Donnell lecture will cover that general material and to give you a kind of basic storyline. The readings in She broaden it. It's not all about questions of gender, but we need to understand that these questions of gender and women's lives were taking place in a society that was urbanizing and shifting towards a consumer-driven mass culture in a way that was really affecting the norms of gender. So that's what the She reading is doing. But then finally, the reading that I wanted to talk about that you'll be seeing tomorrow is the file that's attached. So the Going to the Source doesn't have readings that I like on women in the 20s. So I've added a reading that's from another book. The first 3 or 4 snippets that are in that file are all primary sources, and they're all quite short. They're like a page to a page and a half. And then following those 4 primary sources will be a secondary source from a contemporary historian who's writing about an issue of the time period, just to set up the general parameter of the idea for tomorrow. Here's the question that you should be asking. So, women win the right to vote. So now what? What happens after a movement has a success? What actually changes at that point? What issues are resolved and what issues remain unresolved? What new questions and new challenges emerge after a movement has been successful? How much does gaining the suffrage actually change women's lives and women's status? And was suffrage, in fact, the major concern and issue for the majority of women ever, much less in the 1920s? Those will be some of the questions that you'll be able to think about as you look through the sources for tomorrow. So when we get to tomorrow, I will talk some about those sources. In the meantime, you can think about these wartime diaries, and I will see you then tomorrow. Thanks, everyone.